Donald Trump has torn up the rulebook of international relations with this week's extraordinary extraction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from Caracas. I think we're looking at the beginning of a much more chaotic new era in geopolitics. One particular zodiac sign's fingerprints are all over this operation and that shift. That sign is Aries. This is World Astrology Report. I'm your host, Dan Waits, and welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. We're moving from a time of relative order in the global system to disorder. I'm going to lay out the astrological case for that. But first of all, we're going to look at what just happened in Venezuela and what the short-term astrological triggers of it were. Now, in my forecast for January 2026, I said 2026 is not the kind of year that's going to give us a gentle lead-in while we review our New Year's resolutions and idly ponder what it's going to bring. It's coming in hot. It never looked like a year that was going to start slowly in terms of world events. And this US operation in the Venezuelan capital has confirmed that that part of the forecast was on the money. The operation began around 2 a.m. Venezuela time on January the 3rd, with the US bombing a series of targets around Caracas, including military bases and reportedly the complex where the tomb of the former president and leftist revolutionary Hugo Chavez is located. The US forces cut the power to the city and sent in a special forces team that seized Maduro and his wife and flew them to the US. Maduro is now in jail in New York and will be put on trial for charges related to drug trafficking. Trump has said that the US is now going to run Venezuela. And he's been very clear about what is surely a big motivation of this action: to secure control of Venezuela's massive oil reserves, which at an estimated 300 billion barrels are the largest on the planet. Now, as much as the precise nature of this operation seemed to take most people, myself included, by surprise, viewers of this channel won't be too surprised about what's happened. The operation began as a potent full moon in Cancer was shining in the sky. And as I said in my January forecast, this full moon was always going to be a big one for the United States because it was located at 13 degrees of Cancer. This is a critically important degree for the US because in the Sibly natal chart for the country, the sun is right there. Cancer is the 8th whole sign house of the US chart, and the US actually has a stellium of planets in that sign. The 8th house is the house of the resources of others. It's also the house of investments and debt. Think of how important debt has been in the growth and maintenance of the United States as empire. The US is able to finance a massive amount of debt because of the dollar's status as global reserve currency. And again, thinking of that 8th house of other entities' resources, again, Trump has been very clear about seizing control of Venezuela's vast oil reserves. It's a big contrast even to the Iraq War that began in 2003, soon after 9/11. Back then, we knew that oil reserves were part of the motivation for the invasion, but this was never stated explicitly by then President George W. Bush. Anyway, this full moon was always going to be important for the US, but why did it also single out Venezuela? Well, I have to admit that I missed this in my last forecast, but the independence of Venezuela was proclaimed on July the 5th of 1811. Yes, that's very close to July the 4th. And so in Venezuela's untimed natal chart, the sun is at 12 degrees of Cancer, very close to the US's sun and very close to this full moon. Given that the US and Venezuela were already in something of a conflict, you could actually have predicted something big involving both of them on or around this day, just using the country's natal charts alone. But there was more going on with this full moon, a lot more. If you're enjoying this video so far, then please do click the like button and subscribe to the channel to register your support for the work I'm doing here. And a quick note to say that I've opened up some new consultation slots in January. I specialize in helping people to identify their calling and purpose in life. If you're looking for that kind of help, then hit me up and grab a slot while they're available. Thanks for listening. And let's get into this. All right, at the time of January the 3rd's full moon, both Mars and Venus were quite tightly conjunct the Sun. Both Mars and Venus are planets associated with desire. Mars takes action to satisfy desire, while Venus stokes desire and represents those things that inspire it, including wealth and riches. In certain forms of astrology, like Mayan astrology, Venus was seen as a war planet. And we've seen wars starting in the past at Mars-Venus conjunctions. For example, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 at one of them. Mars-Venus conjunctions are often about taking what you want, regardless of the consequences. In the charts of individuals, that often applies in a sexual context. But on the world stage, it applies to relations with other countries. The sun, for its part, represents central figures, like presidents. And here we had an operation to quite literally kidnap one, and ultimately to allow American oil companies to get their hands on a lot of treasure. A lot of people seem to be quite shocked by this action, but actually it's not that unprecedented or unusual by historical standards, although Trump's directness about his motivations is something new. What's weird is that the US has taken dramatic action involving foreign leaders at a couple of times before on this very date, January the 3rd. On January the 3rd, 1990, after the US had invaded Panama, the dictator of that country, Manuel Noriega, surrendered to the US military and was flown to Miami to face trial, also on drugs charges. Very similar. Then, as now, there was a stellium of planets in Capricorn, a sign of authority and incumbent institutions. And on January the 3rd of 2020, the US under Trump assassinated the Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani by drone strike, again with a stellium of planets in Capricorn. What is it about January the 3rd? The so-called based Chinese professor and star of the Predictive History YouTube channel, Jiang Shuaqin, claims it's because the number 13 has cosmological significance for what he calls the Freemasonic Empire of America. But from an astrological perspective, on January the 3rd, the sun is at 12 or 13 Capricorn, closely opposing its position in the US's natal chart, where it's at 13 Cancer. That seems significant and perhaps signifies moments where the US's power becomes very visible in how it treats other nations. But anyway, even though what the US has done in Venezuela doesn't actually seem unprecedented, it has provoked a lot of anxiety in some circles about its meaning and implications, particularly because of how Trump has presented it, and because he's made no effort to hide his motivations or appeal to the quote-unquote system. There's a lot of disillusion in the air, not just around this action, but more generally. And that might clue you in to what we're going to talk about next, the ongoing conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. Right now, Neptune is in the very last degree of Pisces, which is, of course, also the very last degree of the entire zodiac. The last degree of a sign is known as the anaretic degree. Planets at these degrees can often be very problematic in their expression. They can behave in extreme or unbalanced ways. They're like someone who's about to move house and is in a rush to get everything done before they move on. And among the many things that Neptune represents is oil. With Neptune at the anaretic degree of Pisces, we've seen dramatic events that center around that very commodity. But oil isn't at the heart of what Neptune represents. Neptune primarily signifies the ideal, the imaginal, the collective, and the imaginary. And right now, Neptune is in conjunction with Saturn. Saturn is a limiting, sobering, realistic planet. And the combination of Saturn and Neptune in conjunction since 2023 has brought forth a sense of disillusion, one that seems to be being felt across the world and the political spectrum. For example, in the US, Trump's opponents despair about his administration and how, for them, it represents a betrayal of certain fundamental American principles. But they're also disillusioned about the state of the left and the Democratic Party too, which is also very unpopular right now, according to polls. But even large sections of Trump's MAGA support base seem to be feeling disillusioned in the face of his broken promises of unprecedented transparency, his embrace of the incoming AI-based digital panopticon, and his fervent support of Israel and its flattening of Gaza. So it seems that at least one of the things a Saturn-Neptune conjunction does is deconstruct and then reconstruct the kind of illusions that make the world go round. Political scientists have a term they use that's very relevant to the Saturn-Neptune cycle, the imaginary. In political science, an imaginary refers to people's shared beliefs about the political order. It's the story that society tells itself about how power really works and about what's possible and what isn't. These Saturn-Neptune conjunctions seem to signal resets to the dominant narrative about how the world is supposed to work. For example, there were 3 of these conjunctions in 1952 and 1953 in the sign of Libra, the scales. The period that followed was the Cold War, when the global system was thought to consist of a balance between 2 major powers and their empires, the US and the Soviet Union. And in 1989, at the last conjunction of Saturn and Neptune, which was also joined by Uranus, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. That year, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama published an essay entitled The End of History, which was later turned into a famous book. It argued that with the US's victory in the Cold War, liberal democracy and market capitalism no longer had any serious rivals. That conjunction took place in Saturn's earthy sign of Capricorn, and it seemed to indicate the beginning of the unipolar era when the US was the sole superpower in the world. But in that period, there was also the pretense that international law and institutions governed how nations could act on the world stage. For example, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, also strongly motivated by the desire to grab oil, he nevertheless did put quite a bit of effort into trying to secure the consent of the UN for the invasion, and he assembled a multinational, quote-unquote, coalition of the willing. Again, this was kind of nonsense in a sense, because the US was going to do what it wanted, but the deference to laws and institutions was at least formally there, and it was thought that that was necessary. But in 2026, in Donald Trump's new era, things have changed. A fresh Saturn-Neptune conjunction is coming in February in the very first degree of the sign of Aries. The martial sign of Aries doesn't really care what anyone else thinks. It just does what it wants. It pursues its interests, its inspiration, without self-consciousness. And this seems to fit the new orientation of the United States and perhaps the world more generally. There's much more of a sense that this administration just does what it likes. There's no coalition, there's no appeal to the UN, there's just action. Trump's introduction of tariffs is an example of this. It was a unilateral restructuring of the global trade system and a move away from globalization to a more fragmented multipolar world. Again, I think the sign of Aries really characterizes this approach, in contrast to the last Saturn-Neptune sign of Capricorn, which, given its rulership by Saturn, does have to do with order. Aries is not a sign of order. So we're now entering a much more chaotic period of world history where states just pursue their interests regardless of legal or diplomatic niceties. It looks like a return to the era of great power competition where multiple powerful countries compete to secure their own spheres of influence, and geopolitics becomes much more about the assertion of raw power. But there's another aspect of this that we need to consider, and that context is ongoing global conflict. If you just see this as being about US-Venezuela relations or about Donald Trump's recklessness or even about the desire for oil, you're going to miss what's really going on here. I don't think what's happened in Venezuela is just about getting oil for oil's sake. There's a global conflict underway between the US and its allies versus certain rising powers led by China and Russia. Some analysts are calling this Cold War 2.0. And in my opinion, there's some good astrological evidence that that's actually what's going on in the world right now. The most powerful planetary cycle that I've personally researched is the synodic cycle of Pluto and Neptune, which lasts almost 500 years and governs the deepest trends driving change in the realms of faith and global power. And that cycle is telling us that from 2026 to 2032, we're entering a critical period of history because we're coming to the end of a period of change for the world that began in the 1940s with the Second World War. Let me explain. In 1891 and 1892, Pluto and Neptune formed 3 conjunctions in the sign of Gemini. And since the 1940s, they've been in a sextile, which is going to last about a century all in all, and take us into the 2030s. This chart, generated by Archetypal Explorer, shows how close the 2 planets have been to forming exact sextiles over the past 100 years or so. You can see how they came into orb of the sextile in the 1940s, and they were pretty close to sextile constantly between that time and the late 1980s. And as you may have realized, that period coincides very closely with the Cold War, which is generally held to have begun in 1947 and ended after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The Cold War was essentially a split, a bifurcation of the world into two competing blocks. Remember, this Pluto-Neptune cycle began in Gemini, the sign of the twins. These Pluto-Neptune cycles that begin in Gemini seem to bring great bifurcations to the world. From the late 1980s to the 2020s, Pluto and Neptune separated quite a bit from their sextile, and this period coincided pretty well with that of US dominance as sole superpower. The two-ness, the Gemini-ness, if you like, of the global system faded for a time. But right now, Pluto and Neptune are getting close again to making exact sextiles, which they're going to start doing again this year in 2026 and every year until 2032. And we're hearing all this talk of a second Cold War. Perhaps 2026 is the year that a new Iron Curtain falls on the world. Of course, some people are saying World War III is coming. I don't know about that. I think we need to prepare mentally for difficult possibilities. But I do think that if the Cold War II model is correct, it's going to get a lot hotter in early 2026. I think we could see explosive developments involving both China and Russia in the second half of January. The astrology is pointing this way, plus I think it's likely they'll want to respond in some way to what Trump's just done in Venezuela. Frankly, the first 4 months of this year look like they'll be crazy. I think that by the middle of the year, we're going to have a much better idea of where the world is heading. But expect a lot of action and change in the world. Now, in the bonus section of this video, available for members of World Astrology Report, we're going to look at Trump's update to the Monroe Doctrine, which he has called the Donroe Doctrine, and see some amazing astrology that tells us why that doctrine is back in the news this very week. Thanks for watching, everyone, and see you again on the channel very soon.